So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Leanne Jackson. I work as the head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division at the OECD. And that team leads the work on food systems, but we also produce an annual report with the FAO on agricultural outlook for agricultural commodity markets. And we have some standard setting work too on tractors, fruits and vegetables, seeds, for example. We're really excited to spend this hour with you, and we're really happy that we're joining forces with the Public Governance Directorate of the OECD to explore how deliberative processes can help make better policies for food systems. So I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, so you know that we at the OECD, we've been actively engaging in the preparations for the UN Food Systems Summit. In the lead up to the pre-summit, which is on the 19th and 21st of July, and the actual UN Food Systems Summit, which will be sometime September, October later this year, conversations are focusing now on identifying game-changing solutions and collective areas for actions for food systems. Elements identified and agreed on will then have to be implemented by countries. So we think that this webinar can help contribute to thinking about how OECD can continue to use convening power to take a closer look on how food system policies can be designed and implemented to make better policies for food systems. So again, we're sort of focusing on the how of making better policies today. So just again, as a reminder, we are recording this session so that others who can't join us today can benefit from the discussions. So also, in order to help us have an exchange during the second half of the session, I encourage you all to use the chat function to send your questions through on the presentations. We'll have about half an hour of presentations, and we're hoping to carve out a half an hour to have panel discussion on the questions that come in. So let me now introduce Koen de Koninck, who's an economist in my team and who was the lead author of the OECD's report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems, which was published earlier this year. And he also wrote a report on concentration in seed markets, which was published in 2018. He's worked as a management consultant with Bain & Company before the OECD, and he'll be presenting focusing on achieving better policies for food systems, how to navigate facts, interests, and values. So I'll hand the floor over to Koen, who will be disciplined and take 7 minutes in his presentation. Thanks, Koen.
Let's find out. I'm just going to share my screen now. Hi, everyone. Good to see everybody here in this how-to webinar on how we can use deliberative processes to make better policies for food systems. So in my presentation, as Leanne mentioned, we published our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems, earlier in the year. I want to give a very brief synthesis of what we say there, but really the emphasis is on why exactly are we so interested in deliberative processes. So basically setting the scene for the discussion that will follow. So the three core questions that we deal with in our report on making better policies for food systems is first, what is the performance of food systems in terms of the challenges and achievements and the role of policies? The second question is, we know that food systems are complex. We're talking about agriculture, we're talking about nutrition, public health aspects, of course, environmental issues, all of which are already complicated enough. And then there's a whole set of interactions among them. So that means that if you want to create coherent policies, that is a very tricky challenge. But in addition to those challenges of complexity, we also know that there are many other obstacles to achieving better policies for food systems. And we also ask, how can we overcome those obstacles? And so these three questions, the performance, the policy coherence aspects, and achieving better policies, corresponds to the three core chapters of the report. And to give you a very short summary of what we cover in the report, we say that food systems, we are expecting a lot from food systems, but you can synthesize it into three core elements, which is we want food security and nutrition for a global population that is growing and will reach close to 10 billion people by mid-century. We also want livelihoods. There are millions of people around the world who depend on food systems for their incomes. And we're talking not only about millions of farmers and fishermen, but also everybody else who works along food supply chains. And finally, of course, we also need environmental sustainability because food systems have an enormous environmental footprint. In addition, as the COVID-19 challenge has shown, we also need resilience across these three dimensions. And often when you hear policy discussions around food systems, you'll hear very black and white views. people will sometimes say that food systems are broken, which we thought was not a very helpful framing. Because if you say something is broken, it's either broken or it isn't broken. There's not a lot of room for nuance. There's not a lot of room for asking what is going well, what is working well, what can we scale up, what can we learn from successes in some areas. So the key message that we have in our first chapter when we discuss the performance of food systems is that things are actually not as black or white as people sometimes make it seem. We know that food systems have important achievements, but also serious shortcomings. And those shortcomings require effective policy responses. And that is the second key message of that chapter, that we actually know that better policies can make a difference. There is a lot of work by the OECD, but also by many other researchers and organizations that has emphasized that there are many areas where policies could be improved to improve the performance of food systems. But one of the challenges we face when we're thinking about making better policies for food systems is that these food systems, as I already mentioned, are very complex. As this little chart shows you, there are many different aspects that come into play when we're thinking about the food system. And it's easy for policymakers to feel overwhelmed and to wonder how can you come up with something coherent that somehow does justice to all these complexities and all these interaction effects. And so in our second chapter, we propose a number of pragmatic principles for how we can reduce the complexity of the problem and how we can have a pragmatic way to navigate that complexity to come up with coherent policies. But at the same time, we know that coherence itself or reducing complexity of the problem is not the only challenge that we're facing, because part of what makes food systems so complex, so complicated, is that because of all these interaction effects, there are going to be certain trade-offs. There are going to be certain areas where society will need to make difficult choices. So for example, we know that ruminant livestock products have fairly high greenhouse gas emissions. If we reduce consumption of those commodities, of course, that means that the livelihoods for people who work in the ruminant livestock sector, that will have negative implications for their livelihoods. So there are all kinds of trade-offs like that, which force society to make some difficult choices. And it is important that we keep thinking of them as choices. So we need to base those discussions on the best available technical analysis, but we should never lose sight of the fact that in the end, if there is a trade-off, there is a choice to be made, and in that, inevitably value judgments come into play. It really then depends on what society values most or how society chooses between competing objectives. And that brings us to the next question of achieving better policies for food systems, because we know that achieving better policies for food systems is far from easy. And one way of thinking about it is that the reason it is hard to create better policies is that you often see disagreements over facts, over interests and values. And there is a lot we know about how food systems work, but at the same time, there's also a lot we don't know. We don't always have good information about causal mechanisms or about the effectiveness of different types of policies. In addition, we sometimes face gaps between public perception and the evidence. So it's really crucial that we have a way to build a shared understanding of the facts. But the facts only get you so far. The facts can tell you how the world is. It doesn't necessarily tell you how the world should be. So inevitably, interests and values have to come into play as well. And interests matter a great deal, of course, because any change in policy will create winners and losers. And that means in turn that those groups that are affected by a policy change have an incentive to lobby the government to try and move policies in their preferred direction. And by itself, that is not necessarily problematic. In fact, this lobbying process can be useful for governments to find out how a proposed initiative would affect different groups in society. But where things go wrong, of course, is when some groups are more vocal or some groups are better represented or some groups have a privileged access to that policy process. And especially when certain groups are simply not heard at all. So it is important, if we think about processes for better policies, that those processes need to promote transparency, accountability, and create a level playing field so that different groups in society have an equal chance to be heard. And if you look at discussions around food systems, you'll often find a discussion about facts and a discussion about the role of interest groups in those policies. But there is this third component of values that we feel has not always received as much attention as it should. And in a way that is surprising, because if you look at some of the most contentious issues in food systems today, those typically have very strong value components to them, a very strong ethical dimension. So think about a debate like genetically modified organisms. Ostensibly, people are discussing the potential health effects, the potential environmental effects, the potential gains in agricultural productivity. So ostensibly, that is a debate around facts. But in reality, that issue is very controversial because there are numerous value aspects that come into play as well. For example, some people are opposed to the technology because they don't trust large corporations, or they are opposed to the technology because they think it is a technological fix for deeper societal problems, and so on. So understanding those ethical aspects is actually often crucial to understand what is really going on in policy debates around food systems. In addition, what makes value differences so important to understand is that in contrast with disagreements over facts and interests, disagreements over values are actually very difficult to solve. And the reason is, if you think about the disagreement over the facts, at least in principle, we can ask researchers to do more research to gather more evidence. If there is a disagreement over interests, that is of course a little bit more tricky, but at least in theory, again, we could think of some kind of compensation scheme. But those approaches don't really work with values. In fact, the idea of values, almost by definition, that means that you're not willing to accept compensation for giving up a value, something that you really value. So you need to find different approaches of making progress when there is a conflict or a difference over values that comes into play. And the first and arguably the best approach is that you try and think of creative adjustments to a specific policy proposal to see if you can make that policy acceptable to people with very diverse backgrounds. And if that is possible, it's clearly preferable, because then you can achieve a consensus over a specific set of actions without necessarily having to resolve those underlying philosophical differences. But of course, that is not always possible, and sometimes society simply needs to make a difficult decision. And how do you make progress on those difficult decisions? This is, of course, a question that policymakers have been struggling with for a very long time. And we are really interested in exploring the potential of deliberative processes. And so, as my colleague Claudia Juárez will explain in a minute, there is a lot of interesting evidence recently from experiments that have been done in many different countries, or experiences in many different countries, where these kinds of deliberative processes have been used to make progress on some very thorny issues. So this, in a nutshell, is our report on food systems. And you'll see that we put a lot of emphasis on the how of how do you make better policies, and not just the what of what are the policy recommendations that we make. That is not a coincidence, and there's more than one reason for that. The first reason is that food systems are very complex, and there is an enormous heterogeneity and an enormous, there are a lot of local differences. And so it's really difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all set of policy recommendations. A lot of the appropriate policies will have to be designed in different countries, or even at subnational levels. So it is important that we think about the right process for doing that, because it's not something that can be done centrally once and for all for everybody. And the second issue is that we simply believe that having better policy processes is a really important precondition to achieve better policy outcomes as well. So that's why we are, in addition to ongoing research where we are looking at the facts, and we're looking into data and evidence gaps on food systems at the moment. In addition, we are organizing webinars such as the one today, where we are exploring the how do you make better policies for food systems. So in addition to today's webinar, where we are looking at deliberative processes as a potential tool, we also will have a webinar on how to use regulatory impact assessments. This will be on Tuesday, the 27th of April. And the idea there is that a regulatory impact assessment can actually help you with this problem of policy coherence in a complex system. It forces you to think through a checklist of different potential outcomes, different potential areas that could be affected when you're proposing a new policy. And we'll also have another webinar on how to design national food systems policies that will be on Tuesday, the 4th of May, where we will be discussing some recent country examples of where people have tried to come up with coherent policies for food systems. So I would just like to finish by saying a few more words about the UN Food Systems Summit. So as many of you will know, in September of this year, the United Nations will hold a Food Systems Summit, which is a catalyst for policy discussions on food systems. And what is interesting there is that that process simultaneously mobilizes the science. So there is a scientific group that is reviewing the evidence, and we are engaged with that process. And in parallel, there are food systems dialogues that are being organized at the national level, at the global level, and at subnational level as well. And that actually already is a recognition of the importance of reconciling different values and different viewpoints around what the priorities should be for food systems at all the different levels. So that, I think, links very closely with what we want to be discussing here today. So to wrap up, I just want to highlight that the OECD is contributing to this food systems summits by sharing our expertise. We have expertise on a wide range of topics related to food systems. And much of that is synthesized in our reports, but I also invite everybody to take a look at our portal webpage to find all of the relevant OECD analysis on food systems. Or, of course, feel free to reach out directly if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Koen, for kicking us off and for giving us this framework for thinking about food systems. I think it really sets us up for getting into this, this topic of deliberative processes with the food systems as the backdrop. So now let me introduce our second speaker, Claudia Falish. She's a policy analyst from the Public Governance Directorate at the OECD. And she's a co-author of the recent OECD report, which was entitled Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions Catching the Deliberative Wave. Claudia is also coordinates the Innovative Citizen Participation Network, which is a network that brings together leading international practitioners, academics, public servants, and designers to discuss these important issues. Claudia will be presenting some key findings from her report, The Deliberative Processes Catching the Deliberative Wave, and I give the floor over to Claudia now. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Leanne. Just sharing my screen here as well. So my name is Claudia Falish. I'm a policy analyst who's leading on the work around innovative citizen participation in the OECD's Open Government Unit. And it's a pleasure to be here today to share the key findings from our report that was published in June last year, which is the first empirical and comparative study of representative deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, consensus conferences, and so on, that have been used specifically in the context of informing public decision making. Examples such as the French Citizens Convention on Climate that took place last year. So here you see the 150 citizens who were members of this Citizens Convention, broadly representative of French society. They came together over the course of 9 months to put together concrete recommendations to the French government about how France could reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030, 40% by 2030, sorry, in a spirit of social justice. Another example from a different level of government is the Poznań Citizens Panel on the climate crisis. So here at the city level, there are 70 people that have been brought together to be broadly representative of the city of Poznań, with a task of coming up with concrete recommendations for how the city can amend its green spaces and forests, and also how it can completely eliminate the use of coal within the city. Before I dive into some of the key findings of this report, though, I want to take a moment to really define what we're talking about as a representative deliberative process, because, well, first of all, I appreciate it's a mouthful of a term. It's also something probably not everyone has come across before, and it's also quite different to some of the more participatory processes that some people here might be familiar with, and is quite distinct to traditional consultations as well. So the starting point is always a problem. These deliberative processes are really intended for problem solving. So at the outset, there's a public authority, which can be a ministry, it can be a mayor, it can be an ombudsman or another agency, which has a problem that gets formulated as a clear task in the form of a question. And this gets put to a small representative group of everyday people. So this ranges really from 30 to 150 in some cases, sometimes a little bit more, which becomes the citizens' assembly or the citizens' jury or panel. And these people are chosen through a process which is often called a civic lottery. It's quite specific, so there's a few different forms of it, but the most common is that at the outset, there's a very large number of invitations that go out completely at random, usually to between 2,000 to 30,000 people, depending on the size of the jurisdiction. And amongst all the people who respond positively to that invitation to participate, there's a second random selection process, but this time done in a way to control so that that final group is broadly representative of the community. And this citizens' assembly then goes through three stages. The first is a process of orientation and learning. So people really have the time first to just meet and get to know each other. Usually there's some form of a social moment, of a coffee or a dinner. People take the time to define what values are going to be guiding their deliberation. And then there's a very, very crucial learning stage. So there's an emphasis on having access to a very broad and large range of information, which is both in written form, videos, but also by expert presentations. But not just experts, also a chance for stakeholders and advocates to be able to bring their evidence to this group of people as well. So after that takes place, there's then the stage of deliberation, in the sense that the participants in this citizens' assembly, they have a chance to weigh the evidence they've heard, to hear each other's perspectives, to listen to one another, and to try and identify where they have some common ground on the recommendations that they begin to formulate for the public authority on this issue. So this final stage is that drafting of the recommendations. Usually in many processes, again, there's a bit of a diversity of this, but usually there's an aim to find around 80% consensus for it to become a recommendation of the group. And there's sometimes a kind of minority report which gets included of the recommendations that were discussed but did not achieve that supermajority amongst the group there. But that's not the end of the process. These then get put back to the public authority, who responds to each of the recommendations saying yes or no, with an explanation of the rationale if there's a no, of why not, and a sense of how and when they'll be implemented. So these representative deliberative processes have been building over, the use of them has been building over time, hence our title of the deliberative wave. The earliest examples of the 289 case studies that we have are from the 1980s, but it's really been since about 2010 that we've seen them used more often. We've also been updating our database since this report was published, and already have well over 100 new examples since 2019, which is to say that if that data was on this graph, it would literally be off the charts, and is also why we think that this is something that's worth the attention of better understanding how these can be done well and when they're useful. The examples that we have in the report come from 18 different OECD countries plus the international level. The largest numbers of examples are from Germany, Australia, Canada, and Denmark. And the examples come from all levels of government. So about half of them come from the local level, which in many ways wasn't a surprise because there are many, many more municipalities out there than there are national governments. But about 30% are at the regional state level, 15% at the national level, and 3% at the international level. And I do point out that actually almost all of the regional state examples come from Canada and Australia, which are both federal countries, and most of the issues that are addressed at that level of government there would be national level issues in most European countries. So I say that because I think sometimes there's a bit of a myth that these processes are only useful at the local level, but actually we have many examples at all levels of government. One of the questions we were most interested in better understanding is what sorts of policy issues are these deliberative processes being used by public authorities to address? So the first thing we noted was that actually there's a very huge and wide range of different topics that have been addressed in this way, but that many of them have been to do with issues of urban planning, health, environment, strategic planning, and infrastructure. But a better way in terms of contemplating whether a deliberative process is useful or appropriate in a situation or not, we found is that to think about the types of problems that these processes are well suited to address, and that being three main characteristics, one being values-based dilemmas, the second being complex problems that require trade-offs, and the third being long-term questions that help to surpass those short-term incentives of electoral cycles. On the back of this empirical evidence, and also working more qualitatively with an expert group of practitioners, public servants, and also academics, we developed the OECD Good Practice Principles for Deliberative Processes. So I'm not going to go into detail about this here, given my 7-minute pitch, but happy to answer any more questions about this if that's of particular interest to those who are here. And so my concluding message to you here is that deliberative processes are not some sort of magic or silver bullet solutions to solving complex issues, but we do have a huge amount of evidence actually that if they are designed well, and I really stress this, if designed well in reference to the good practice principles, then they can help solve hard problems and increase public trust. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was a great overview of the extensive research that you and your colleagues have been doing, and it sets us up really well for the next presentation. So now that we've heard from the OECD experts, let's hear from a practitioner. So we're really delighted to be joined today from Dublin by Sharon Finnegan, who was the secretary to the Irish Citizens Assembly from 2016 to 2019. And during this time, the Assembly considered many big topics, including Ireland's abortion law, responding to an aging population, fixed-term parliaments, the manner in which referenda are held, and how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. Sharon is currently the head of the Climate Action Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister, and she's held many other roles in that office, including head of protocol, head of economic policy, and deputy director of the Northern Ireland and International Division. Sharon's going to present on her experiences running the Irish Citizens Assembly, so we're really looking forward to benefiting from hearing about her experiences, and I pass the floor over to her. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Leanne. Good morning, everybody. I'm just sharing my screen there. Can everybody see that? Great. Good morning, everybody. Well, look, delighted to be here with you, and thanks to the OECD for the invitation. What I want to talk to you about today, as Leanne was saying, is that I've had the benefit and the great honour of running one of these citizens' assemblies in the Irish context. And what we did and what an Irish Citizens' Assembly was around placing the citizens at the heart of very complex legal and social issues facing Irish life. So in our case, it was 99 citizens, ordinary citizens, and a chairperson making up the 100th person, meeting in a residential setting over a weekend, typically gathering on a Friday evening for the social element that Claudia was talking about, meeting all day Saturday, and sometimes a half day, sometimes a full day on a Sunday. And really what we were doing was coming together to address these challenging issues in relation to a number of topics which were set down for us by the Irish Parliament. But I wanted to talk a little bit about where that idea of a citizens' assembly had come from, and the fact that a citizens' assembly in the Irish context was anchored in the Irish parliamentary process. So it initially appeared as a concept, as an idea to have another assembly in the election manifestos for a number of political parties prior to the 2016 election. And that was because we had a citizens' assembly which was very successful from 2014 to 2016, which looked at marriage equality and which led to a constitutional referendum which brought about a legalisation of same-sex marriage in Ireland. And so there was an acceptance among the political system, I suppose, that this was a good way of dealing with challenging issues. It ultimately appeared in the programme for partnership government when a government was formed, and then it went on to be approved by a resolution of both houses of Parliament. And so therefore our mandate as a citizens' assembly was derived from the Parliament, and we were required to report to both houses. But it's interesting to note that our topics were laid out initially by government, but the topic of climate change was added by an amendment by one of the parties who were not members of government, the Green Party. So the climate change agenda was very much brought to us by the Parliament as opposed to by the government, who had tabled the motion initially. So I think that's very important, just to understand that kind of cross-party support that was there for its inception, if you like. So the topics we discussed were the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which is the one that may be familiar to some of you because it got a huge amount of coverage internationally and indeed nationally, and that was the prohibition on abortion, which was in place in Ireland at the time, the challenges and opportunities of an ageing population, making Ireland a leader in tackling climate change, the manner in which referenda are held, and fixed term parliaments. And I suppose important to note that we were originally given 12 months to complete our work, but we were required to seek an extension because the work on abortion ended up taking 6-7 months. And initially it was anticipated that the other topics therefore would only be done over one weekend. But in the end, we required additional weekends for both the ageing population and the climate change topic. And I will come back to discuss that kind of concept of the amount of time and the appropriate amount of time that's required for these topics, because it's not insignificant. So our members were 99 citizens and an independent chairperson selected by the government. So our independent chairperson was Miss Justice Mary Lafoy, who at the time was a sitting member of the Supreme Court in Ireland, she was an excellent choice given the complexity of some of the legal issues we needed to discuss in relation to abortion in particular. They were voluntary, the members, not paid or rewarded for their time, chosen at random to represent the views of the people of Ireland, broadly representative of society as reflected in the census, including age, gender, social class and regional spread. On the social class, just to mention, in Ireland, we requested that would include farmers because they are an important grouping. So we did have a representative number of farmers in the group. And they also had to be on the electoral register to vote in a referendum. So, which was very important given that some of the recommendations went on to be discussed and put to a public vote. What I wanted to say then was just to talk about how the Assembly influenced or informed the public beyond those 99 people. And that transparency and engagement with the wider population was a huge factor and a huge thought behind everything we did. So transparency was sort of the cornerstone of everything we did. All of our meetings were live streamed, archived then afterwards on YouTube. Some of our meetings were broadcast by the state broadcaster, including in relation to climate. We syndicated a lot of that content then out through Facebook, doing lives and so on. We used Twitter. We were always the top trending topic on Ireland for any of the weekends that we met. We tried to engage the public in as many ways as we could, including submissions received from the public. You'll see there we got 13,000 submissions on the 8th Amendment, which, not only being an absolute logistical nightmare to try and go through all of those, it was fascinating to get that level of engagement. By contrast, the number there for climate change seems quite small at 1,200, but in fact that was the largest engagement by the public on climate change ever for any entity in the public in an Irish context. So it's not insignificant and was very important, that wider engagement with the public. So how did we structure our discussion on climate change at the Assembly? So as I said, we met over 2 weekends. We heard from experts on topics to facilitate an understanding of climate change. So in the beginning, we looked at topics like the science of climate change in a broader environmental context, tackling climate change, current efforts in Ireland to address climate change, what's happening internationally, the impacts of climate change, both nationally and internationally, in terms of what was happening and what adaptation was required. And then we had dedicated sessions on energy, transport and agriculture. And those 3 topics were chosen partly because they are the areas where emissions are generated from in an Irish context, but also we had based our structure of the weekends based on feedback from the members. So we asked the members, what do you want to talk about and what do you want to hear from? But also those submissions that I mentioned, we did an analysis of those, and these were the topics that came up. So we had to consider what was the best way to structure that discussion to kind of get the most out of it for the members. So we broke it down in 3 broad ways. Number 1, we got a speaker in to talk about what's current sectoral policy look like in Ireland. What does transport policy look like? What are emissions in the transport sector like? And what policies and processes are in place in order to address transport emissions. So we did that for each of them. And then we asked another speaker to come in and say, well, look, if Ireland was a leader in tackling climate change, because that's what we were asked to do, what would that look like? What would we need to do? And we got each of those sectors broken down in that way. And then we looked for examples of real leadership in each of the sectors in action. So that was the structure that we had in each case. And that kind of back to the piece that Claudia was talking about, that evidence, the presentation of evidence. And then we went on to have present our recommendations. And across all of the topics, the recommendations were member-led. And what I mean by that is that the idea of what they want to talk about, you know, that initial concept of, you know, what would you like to see reflected on a ballot paper. Ideas were sought and gotten from the members themselves, and then incorporated into a draft ballot paper. Members were then allowed to examine that draft paper, give responses. So the whole concept, I suppose, of agency and giving as much agency to members as possible is crucial, and was crucial to the success of the Irish Citizens' Assembly. The objective being that the members themselves have full ownership of the process. They have the final decision on the wording of the ballot paper, and then the recommendations themselves emerge from a secret ballot of the members. But I suppose it's important to mention, and I'll come back to this, is what we're not trying to achieve is consensus in advance of the vote. We're just trying to ensure that the wording is reflective of what the members want to see included on a ballot paper. And I'll come back to that because it's important. So in relation to the recommendations, there were 13 recommendations on the climate change topic in total across governance, transport, energy, agriculture, and the Assembly then also made further ancillary recommendations, and I can talk about those maybe in questions afterwards. The full details of the recommendations are included there on that link, and I will these will be circulated afterwards so people can have a look. But I just wanted to focus in relation to the recommendations relevant to the food, agriculture and land use, because I know a lot of people today are interested in these issues. So 97% of the members voted that the state should end all subsidies for peat extraction. And of course, that's an important issue for Ireland, because obviously peat is a sink. It extracts carbon from the atmosphere, but in an Irish context, it was one of the main ways one of the ways in which electricity is generated here in Ireland. So that was an important issue to the members. They wanted to see that ended. 89% voted that there should be a tax on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which is a very startling recommendation. I'll come back to that in a moment. 93% recommended that the state should introduce measurement of food waste, and then 99% voted that there should be revised supports for land use diversification. But I want to come back to number 11 there, that recommendation on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and that there should be a tax on them. And you'll note that the recommendation has two clauses at the end of it. One, that there should be rewards for the farmer for management of land that sequesters carbon. And then number two, any resulting revenue from greenhouse gas, or from the tax levelled on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, should be reinvested into climate friendly agricultural practices. And that language was really important, because I think had the recommendation perhaps just been that bold first statement without the two qualifying clauses, I think we may not have seen that 80%, 89% sign up. And this comes back to this question of the drafting of the language of a recommendation. What we don't necessarily want to do is arrive at a place where the citizens are coming up with wording that we can all agree on. That's not necessarily the objective of it. You are trying to pose a challenging question to the citizens. Nonetheless, on this particular topic, and when there was a discussion at the Assembly on this topic, there was very, very engaged discussion from the members, including from some of the farming members, saying, you know, if we are to impose this tax, it would be very challenging from the members. And so therefore, what the members did in order to recognise those challenges is that they asked that these clauses be inserted. And I suppose this goes to the heart of having such a complex and challenging topic discussed by a group of citizens like this, and at a Citizens' Assembly, is that there is an opportunity, I suppose, to recognise those challenges, and to recognise that often these issues are not black and white, and essentially the wording of that topic is, and that recommendation is a recognition of those challenges, if you like. During the discussion on this, I think there was a lot of coverage going through Twitter, and people who were following it saying, God, a really robust discussion here on the challenges facing the farming sector, and really decent engagement from the citizens about the challenges that are awarded. And yet, when the recommendation came, there was a sense from the members, or a sense from the media and from those commenting on agricultural life, that, oh, well, hang on, was there a robust discussion on this really? And I just put up here some of the reactions that we had to those recommendations. You'll see that it was deemed as being totally out of touch with farmers. And you'll see there at the bottom right hand corner, Creed hits out at knee-jerk response over emissions tax. He was the Minister for Agriculture at the time. And a political correspondence there in the top right, politicians will come under huge pressure to reject the climate proposal. And what I wanted to focus on briefly, and conscious of time, but what I wanted to focus on is, was that criticism of the Citizens' Assembly recommendation, was it valid, and could we have done it better? And what I wanted to do to maybe explore that a little bit is to contrast between the discussions that the Assembly had on abortion, where we discussed the topic for 5 weekends, and our discussion on climate change. So as I say, 5 weekends on abortion, we heard from 25 experts, 6 personal experiences, 17 advocacy groups, 80 hours of listening, discussion and deliberation. By contrast, at the climate change, we had 2 weekend meetings. We heard from 15 experts, so a big gap in the difference between the level of expertise heard from. Same number of personal experiences, but no advocacy groups. We heard from no advocacy groups. And that was partly due to the time available, mainly due to the time available, because we only had 2 weekends. By contrast, at the abortion topic, we only heard from advocacy groups at the very end of the topic, when the chair had satisfied herself by asking the members themselves, did they have sufficient expert evidence? Were there any stones left unturned? Were there other topics that they wanted to hear from? So look, I think it's very clear that there was a difference between those 2 topics, and particularly on a topic as expansive as climate change, we could have, I think, spent a lot more time on it. And when you look at the French example, where they spent 9 months on it, it's clear that that would be the case. There were other contrasts, and just to move on a little bit between the 2, there was a requirement in our terms of reference when we were set up that we would be the work of the Assembly would be considered by a special parliamentary committee. That was set out at the very outset, and we knew, the members knew, that the work that they were going to do would be considered by a committee. There was no such requirement in relation to the remaining topics to be discussed by the Assembly. There was none of that feedback loop back to the parliamentary system. However, there was significant lobbying done following the climate change report, and ultimately it was then went on to be considered by a special parliamentary committee following all of that lobbying. So I think that's really important that happened, and that connection back to the political system is hugely important. And at the end of our process, Justice Lafoy made that recommendation that should be a feature of all Citizens' Assembly work. So I just wanted to finally, before I finish up, talk about the impacts that the recommendations had on policy and law in Ireland. And you saw that the Assembly finalised its report in April 2018, and that parliamentary committee that I mentioned was established in July 2018. They went on to produce a report in March 2019, which was deemed at the time as marking a new era for climate policy. So this group of politicians that came together to make a suite of recommendations building on the work of the Assembly, they went for very far-reaching recommendations. And then the executive branch, in examining that work from the Parliament, used it as a basis for a climate action plan in July 2019. And that work in July 2019, I'm including an excerpt here, and it talks about the work of the Citizens' Assembly being central to the climate action plan, and it's the development of the climate action plan. So that connection back between the Assembly's work onto the parliamentary committee and then onto government policy was clear. And that climate action plan contained a commitment to develop a new climate action amendment bill, which was just published last month in Ireland. And again, in the publication of that report, we saw, and I include a reference here from the Minister's press release on it, noting that the bill was informed and strongly reflecting the recommendations set out in the Citizens' Assembly report. So we can really clearly see that connection between the work of the Citizens' Assembly and the policy work that has emerged since, and indeed law. So look, I could talk about lots of other aspects of it, and I'm looking forward to the questions on it, but hopefully that gives you some sense of it. Many thanks.
Wow, Sharon, thank you so much for that really rich discussion of that process. I personally have so many questions that I want to follow up on, but I'll be disciplined. We have some questions that have come in through the chat. There's one question that I think is pretty relevant from the OECD context, which is the role of facts and evidence and how experts are sort of embedded into the citizen assembly deliberations. So how is the input of experts who are invited to inform the citizens assemblies, how is it moderated to ensure that experts don't try to influence the assemblies towards that expert's preferred solution?
That's a question for me, Leanne, is it? Yeah. I mean, I think we did it through a variety of means. So we had an expert advisory group, which had experts from across a broad range of areas, including an expert in deliberative democracy. So they were part of our group that you know, was involved in developing the work program and so on. I think giving experts too much power in the process, it could be problematic. But if you, so we spread the power, if you like. So the secretariat had a particular role, the chair had a particular role, the expert advisory group had a particular role. The experts who came in were given very clear guidance as to what their topic was and what they were to cover. But I suppose the main guard against that is the citizens themselves and the agency that you give to the citizens themselves. And that's the crucial part, because you have to, and we did continuously go back to the citizens to say, what do you want to hear from? Who do you want to hear from? What topics do you want to see covered? And when we had developed the work program for each weekend, we had a steering group of citizens, and we would run that by them, run the topic by them, run the overview of what we wanted the expert to cover by them. And they often, and almost in every occasion, asked us to tweak that or change it. So I think that level of agency you give the citizens is the main control against other voices having too much power.
Great, thank you very much. I have a question that came in through the chat from, let me find the top of the question, from Henri Stobasan, and I think she's posing it to Claudia, but maybe Sharon may also have comments on it. So the question relates to the costs of participating in these types of deliberative processes. So she asks, there are opportunity costs for participation, particularly for people living in poverty. How can deliberative processes best reduce those? So that's the first angle. And then there's sort of a follow-on question, which is based on your research, how can we account for and negotiate power differences within these deliberative institutions, for example, across gender, across age, across other kind of social markers? So I'll pass it to Claudia, and Sharon, if you want to jump in after, that's great.
Yeah, sure. And perhaps just before jumping in, all I want to say is that what Sharon was just describing about giving the citizens agency is part of the good practice principles and something we highly recommend as well. So a good practice. In terms of the costs for participating, I guess breaking down those barriers to participation, it's something that's really important and that we paid a lot of attention to in doing this research as well. I think there are numerous design factors that can be taken into consideration for this. One of our OECD recommendations is to try and offer a small honorarium for participation. So something that's large enough to compensate people fairly for their time, but not so large that it becomes the incentive for participating itself, as well as providing childcare or covering carrying or travel costs. All those sorts of things should not be afterthoughts and really need to be considered, because they do make a big difference to who actually gets into the room. Another thing is that once they're in the room, it's also why we put a big emphasis on having skilled facilitators there. It's incredibly important that in terms of the power dynamics within the discussions, those facilitators are there to, let's say, temper the people who are most confident and wanting to speak all the time, and also, you know, very skillfully bring in those people who are maybe a bit more reluctant to bring their voice into the discussion. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there so we have time for a bit more questions.
That's great. Sharon, would you like to follow on to that?
Yeah, just on the cost, I mean, I think it's an excellent question, because we had the benefit of having had a convention on the Constitution, another citizens' assembly prior to ours, and we had their experiences, which was that they had a real difficulty retaining young women, particularly young women with children. And so as a result of that, we offered childcare. We offered to cover childcare costs. We also offered additional hotel rooms at the hotel so that they could bring their family along if that was going to be a problem. So we thought of as many innovative ways as we could to try to address that problem. However, we had a different problem. We found it really difficult to retain young men, and we, no matter what we seemed to do in terms of recruitment, we could not retain young men. So we our assembly recommended an honorarium payment, as Claudia talked about, or that at least an honorarium payment would be considered. And actually there's a new citizens' assembly running at the moment, and they have offered an honorarium payment. But exactly those issues that Claudia is talking about, you don't want it to be the incentive itself. There is an issue as well. The honorarium payment has other reasons for including it, because typically you're probably going to get people who are more civic minded if there is no honorarium payment. So you probably get a more representative suite of people if that piece is taken out of it. So there are multiple reasons, I think, to consider the issue of paying people.
Thank you both. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll bounce this one coming in from Alvarez Lathans, who's a question for Sharon about comparison between the two processes for abortion and the climate change consultation. What was your sense about the level of agreement over the facts within the Citizens' Assembly?
I wonder, is that the facts in relation to climate change or the facts in relation? I'm not quite sure what's meant by the question.
Yeah, actually the question said on agriculture. So
okay, yeah, I mean, I think in relation to the climate change discussion, I mean, as I've mentioned, I think it would have benefited from much more engagement and hearing from lots of different voices. I mean, the construct that we came up with was to explain to the citizens, you know, what does the current world look like in Ireland? What does agricultural policy look like in Ireland? How responsible is it for emissions? You know, what's the level of emissions in the Irish economy? What does agriculture mean to the economy more generally? What impact, positive, negative impact, does it have on society? Just to explore all of those issues. And then the second speaker who we had, who was Alan Matthews, who's here on the call, actually, hi Alan, was to explore, well, actually, look, if Ireland was a leader, how could you do that? You know, what would we need to do in order to be able to take a leadership position? What changes would we need to make? And that, in fairness to Alan, he did an amazing job on it, and it was a really good exposition of what would Ireland need to be able to do. But look, at like anything, additional experts and voices would have worked really well there to be able to hear different perspectives on that, and to be able to maybe break it down into, you know, what would this mean for the dairy sector? What would this mean for the beef sector? What would this mean for horticulture? What would this mean for organic farming? What would this mean? You know, to really break it down into much more detail would have, of course, been optimum. And I think if we had the same number of weekends that we'd had on agriculture or on abortion, we would have been able to get into that level of detail. And, you know, we would have had different types of recommendations emerging, I'm sure, but we may well have had the same recommendation that we ultimately got. Those probably would have still been included. There might have been slight nuancing in the language. There might not have been as high a level of agreement on it, perhaps, because the members may have had an enhanced understanding. And I think it really would have benefited the overall discussion and indeed the acceptance of the recommendations more broadly had we heard from advocacy groups who maybe would have been able to respond to some of the recommendations or some of the suggestions that were put forward by the experts. It would have allowed for just a greater interrogation of the issues.
Great, thank you very much. I have what probably could be a shorter answer also to you, Sharon, which is about language. Did you have to deal with multiple languages? And if so, how did you handle that? Because we do have members who are in this call, I think, who would have to be grappling with that kind of question.
Yeah, so we did everything dual dual language, English and Irish, and so we had a translation booth, but we also did Irish Sign Language, so we did Irish Sign Language throughout it. So we had three different languages on the go.
Wow. Okay. I have a question from Mark proper, which is to Claudia, which sort of takes us back, zooming up a bit away from the details. Can you talk us through again what the difference is between deliberative processes and participatory processes?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think an important distinction. And because they're different, I would say they're complementary, and I'm not saying this in a way that one is necessarily better than the other, but they're just very distinct. So when it comes to more participatory processes, these tend to emphasize breadth, being open to anybody who wants to come and participate, trying to get as many people affected by an issue participating in the process. And while that intention is often very good, a lot of the research shows that certain demographics tend to disproportionately participate in open initiatives. So that it tends to amplify the voices of men, people who are well off, people living in more urban areas, people who are well educated, and people who are white. And so there's, and often the participatory processes kind of are designed in a way that, because they're emphasizing breadth, usually they want to just get people's opinions, they want to get people involved, but there's a lot less emphasis on the quality of their dialogue, or there's no learning stage necessarily. So in a deliberative process, on the other hand, usually there's a smaller but broadly representative group of people that is at the heart of it, and the emphasis then is on the quality of their deliberation, which requires time for learning, which requires time to really weigh different perspectives, and with an explicit aim of trying to find common ground. So this doesn't mean everybody 100% agrees on everything, but it's about trying to find, where most people can get to a point of saying, well, I don't necessarily 100% agree with it, but I can live with this. So there is that aim of decision making as well, which is not usually the case or explicit in participatory processes too.
Great, thank you so much. We have so many questions coming into the chat, but we're basically wrapping up. And I wish we had more time, but I know everyone also, their time is precious. So I'm going to move into the wrap up stage. I'll say a few words, but while I'm speaking, if our panelists want to think about what their 30-second take-home message is, you guys will have the last word. So let me just thank everyone who's on the call for joining us. Thank our panelists for this great discussion. It's been really useful. Special thanks to Sharon for sharing these detailed, granular insights into what her process was like. A reminder to everyone that we have 2 more how-to webinars planned, one on the 27th of April, which will be looking at regulatory impact assessment, and another one on May 4th, which is looking at developing and implementing national food strategies. Helia is now putting links to those webinars into the chat, so you all have them there. So now, just to wrap us all up, I'll first ask Koen, then Claudia, and then Sharon to give us their 30-second final message.
I'll keep it very short. I thought this was really fascinating, and I think definitely a topic we should continue exploring. So thanks for both of those presentations.
We kind of lost you, Koen. Can you say that again?
Sorry, I wanted to keep it short and just say that this was really fascinating, and I think we should continue exploring these topics. So thank you to both of the speakers for fascinating presentations.
Great, thank you, Koen. Claudia?
Thanks. I guess as a closing message, I would like to say 2 small things. One is that I think we have quite a lot of evidence at this stage and are actually past the stage of experimentation in many ways. We have a pretty good sense of what works. And at the same time, the second point is just to reiterate what I was trying to get across through the presentation, and that these processes are not some sort of silver bullet, but we also know that if they're designed well, meaning they have a clear purpose, they give citizens agency, there's enough time, they have access to broad information, those barriers to participation are broken down, and a broad cross-section of society is in the room, then they can help solve public problems, and citizens are not only more than willing but also more than competent to be able to come up with really detailed, rigorous policy recommendations to policymakers, and with that there's that potential to increase public trust as well.
Great, thank you so much. And now the final word to Sharon.
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, I think for me, I think citizens' assemblies work really well when you have two different types of topics. For me, one is if there is, a complex topic which has, which has two very different perspectives, and where the discussion typically in public has been on either end of the pole, and you're trying to create some light in the center of the discussion where it hasn't been before. The other part where I think it works really well is if it's a topic that the public don't understand, and we're educating the public, it would be beneficial to society more broadly. And I think climate change really falls into that topic. I think probably changes that are going to be required to how we use our land as we consider climate change is a really useful topic to be considered. And I think for anyone who's considering doing it, for me, the biggest issue that needs to be considered when designing a process is agency, and how you give agency to the members, because that is the golden key, I think, to making sure that your process is robust, that you can stand over the process. The citizens feel that they can stand over the process, and they're proud of it by the end of it, because they know it's been done well and done right. And if you give them agency, that's how you achieve that.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Please join us for the next ones. And thank you again to all our panelists. Have a good day, everyone.